Welcome everyone to our 15th, our second to last session in the Gospel of Mark. Today it is, the events of today are some of the most famous, the most impactful, the most well-known events of the entire Gospel. And as we go through this section for today, which is basically right after the disciples flee and Jesus is brought into the council, to the authorities, it's all about those unfolding events, which we know so well. And today, what I'm going to ask you to keep in mind is the ways that they relate to prediction fulfillment that Jesus has made throughout the gospel, about what the passion will be like, what he will have to go through, how it relates, say, to the parable of the talents. Not the talents, the tenants. I do that all the time. The parable of the tenants, how it relates to that. And then in this section, Mark employs the technique of irony. He uses irony so much. And so it's really valuable to really appreciate the way in which so much that's happening happens on multiple levels, where an intended thing that is said or done conveys so much more, and often truth beyond what the surface level of the words is. So we'll be hitting a lot of that stuff today, but this is one of the most, just the most emotional and, difficult sections because it's so personal. But notice too how Mark writes quite differently than, say, Mel Gibson in his interpretation in the Passion of the Christ. This is quite a truncated version of the events of some of the Passion. So just pay attention to that. It also has my very favorite section of the entire gospel, and what Mark does here as a writer, and how he communicates, how he connects pieces of the story, and how fraught with power and emotion it is as he does what he does. It's just, again, a sign of his brilliance as a communicator and as an author. So we'll be touching on all this good stuff. But as always, before we jump into the readings, do you have any questions or comments based on what you've read, either for this week or prior?
I had a question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Bob.
Oh, we're not on mute. All right. Anyway, this morning I was asking Horty to explain one part of the...
It's not till next week.
Oh, okay. I was going to talk about the torn curtain. I didn't understand the symbolism, but maybe I'm getting ahead.
Well, we will definitely be talking about that. So we will, but that is a little, that is for next week. But again, these images do kind of relate to some of the material we're studying today, but the torn curtain is certainly an image that we will be talking about next week as we wrap up gospel. Carol. You're still on mute. There we go.
I was just curious in starting with verse 24. It says they crucified him and divided up his clothes. And then the next verse starts again talking about the crucifixion, and it goes back to the crucifixion. And why do they... It seemed disjointed to me. And was that kind of put in separately? To me, it should have been ahead of the other one.
Well, we stopped today right at verse 24. So we end at that point where they said, and they crucified him. But the experience that he has on the cross, crucifying him is to basically lift him up into that position on the cross. And then what he experiences afterwards in terms of his suffering and maybe some of the existential calling out that he has, and the misunderstanding that people have as to what he's saying, all of that happens, afterwards, after they initially crucify him. Okay, but the act of crucifying means to simply lift him into the position of one crucified.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank
Yeah, so it can be a little disjointed, but I'm not aware of any, in this case, any sort of other traditions that have been inserted or overlapped in
you.
this
Okay,
case.
that does make sense.
Mhm,
Thank you.
mhm. No, thank you for the question. Anyone else? Horty.
I was struck by a couple of things. Excuse me. One was that they blindfolded him. And we've talked so frequently about people having their sight restored and that being a part of being re-included in the community. And so I was just struck by the fact that they blindfolded him, really truncating him from community, and also so that he didn't have the ability to look anybody in the eye, or they didn't have to receive him looking them in the eye.
Yeah, there's a lot of rich symbolism there for sure, both in what you've said, but also it sort of is another illustration of their own unwillingness to step forward with the way that they're treating him and to be seen for who they really are. It's sort of this another way that they exhibit this way of hiding from what their true intentions are. But yeah, there's a lot that's happening in those moments of mocking, of beating, of creating clothes for him, all that stuff. And we'll get into that.
And historically, in my own sense of reading this, it rekindled in me the frustration of, Jesus, why don't you say something? Why don't you say something? So I'm struck by how often he says nothing. And coming from the place of at least the amount of study that we've done with this, I was sort of surprised because in the past, he's been able to say such disarming kinds of things. He's been able to really turn things about in such a, and I don't want to say clever way, but in such a deeply meaningful way. And here he says nothing. So I remember as a kid reading this, and that really surprised me. And yet my sense is that as we've talked about him knowing that his path was that of absolute truth, and that he's at this point where there's nothing that I can say that's going to do anything to change this prophecy, to change this need. All that's needed to be said has been said.
Exactly. I think you've found it at the end there as something really crucial to mark. We will see in this passage we're about to read, the character Jesus speaks in ways of clarity and specificity that is without peer in the entire gospel. And after he says that, he says nothing more. So you've really hit on something here, that there's this awareness that what he's just said is what he has to say, and he need not say it again, because those that receive him in the way they do, it's already a cast die in that sense. Birdie?
In line with him not speaking, I noticed the only time he does is when they directly ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" And I wondered if that's the only charge that was true, and that's why he answered that, because he's truth, and the other charges were not true.
There was not any charge named that was sort of criminal in terms of the Roman law, but it was a power play, a matter of political convenience and expediency, all that stuff that we've seen before, that this is how the weak ones act. But what's interesting about all the charges and all the claims is that there is on one hand a level of mocking, but on a deeper level, a level of profound truth. And that's what Mark is trying to have us see, because we as the audience are the ones that have a unique perspective to receive this. That's what we'll really be attending to. That's where Mark employs so much irony in this passage, is that the characters think they're saying one thing, and yet the way we receive it is in a whole different realm of layers of meaning there. All right, are we ready to jump in? Can I get 4 volunteers for a reading today? Horty? Marilyn, thank you. I know it's a little tedious to do it like this perhaps, but yeah, let's have some people that haven't read in a while. But you have to raise your hand in case you're still, Dan, are you raising your hand?
Nope.
Okay. And then one more. There you go, Carol, thank you. All right, I'm going to switch it over to the shared screen so we can look at the text. All right, so the first reader is Horty, and would you please read the entire section here called Jesus Before the Council?
Jesus before the council. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' But even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?' But he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?' All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to strike him, to say, 'Prophecy.' The guards also took him over and beat him.
And that word, just to be clear, that's prophesy. So that's the action of to make a prophecy. So they're
Thank
telling
you.
him to prophesy.
Thank you.
Next reader is Marilyn. Please finish this section here. The Peter denies Jesus. If you're reading now, Marilyn, you're still on mute.
I know.
Oh, okay, there you go. I couldn't see your
realized that.
face.
Peter denies Jesus. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. Then after a little while the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
Thank you. Okay, let's see here. The next reader is Dan. Dan, would you please read these next 2 sections, Jesus before Pilate, and then Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified.
Jesus before Pilate. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See why many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now, at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now, a man named Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
Thank you, Dan. And Carol, you will read the section "Soldiers Mock Jesus" and then just the first paragraph of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole court. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide which each should take.
All right, thank you. A lot of hard stuff in there. And a lot of stuff that we, once again, know so well that it sometimes the comfort, the familiarity with the passage can interfere with our appreciation of what else might be said. So we'll see how that comes up today. It may or may not. I never really know. But one of the things that I want to start with is that we've talked about this before, but just recognize this and notice how Mark kind of handled this. But crucifixion as capital punishment is the purview only of Rome. Only Rome could mete out a sentence of crucifixion. It was not within the power of the Jews to enact that. But notice the way Mark characterizes the interaction. And it's important why he does that. In part, it protects, it's sort of a softening of an accusation against Rome for what was its exclusive right to do this, to do a crucifixion. But also, and I think more importantly for Mark, it really tells us something about Pilate's character and what kind of soil he represents. We'll get into that. But I felt like it was important to start there because the characterization of the story, historically speaking, has led to, well, many instances of anti-Semitism and accusation of the Jews being at fault, the Jews in general being at fault for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, in Mark's gospel throughout, he has never accused the Jews as a body, as a general body, of being any one thing. But those who have the finger pointed at them are the Jewish authorities, the Jewish Sanhedrin. That's the ruling class. That would include the scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, that crew. We've seen a consistent sort of oppositional relationship between them and Jesus throughout the gospel. And when Mark is talking about the Jews in this instance, it is referring to them and to their attitude towards them. Now, I hope that's obvious to you. I hope that's not revelatory to you, but it's also, even if that's something you are familiar with, it's good to bear that in mind as we move through this material. So having said that, let's go through kind of more step by step. In terms of the events that we see and what plays out, how do what Mark is talking about here, especially in the first, well, I guess throughout the whole thing, to be honest, how does it connect to the apocalyptic discourse? Remember the part in chapter 13 where Jesus is talking about this is what's going to happen? How does it connect to all that? Bonnie?
Well, hadn't he previously said that they would desert him, that they would not stay with him? Last week, we talked about them falling asleep. Every time he left, he'd tell them to stay awake, and he came back and they'd be asleep. And this is just further, this is where Peter's denial and all of that happens. So it's further that they didn't really stick with him.
Yeah, well, it's a continuation. So just like he basically told them the whole time that they wouldn't be able to drink from the cup that he drank, and then they exhibited it, the apocalyptic discourse, Jesus very specifically says, you will be handed over to councils, condemned to death, beaten. He said in synagogues, but in this case, it's the chief priest's house, which isn't that far off. It's sort of a line by line, nearly fulfillment of what he was talking about in the apocalyptic discourse of chapter 13. So this is Mark's way of illustrating once again Jesus' credibility and reliability as a prophet. They keep saying, you don't know what you're doing, you can't save yourself, prophesy, blah blah blah, and he's shown us throughout how reliable a prophet he really is. But it's only us as the audience that gets to see that. The characters in the story, they miss it. And that's part of the brilliance. That's the multivalent, multi-layered meaning of this section of the gospel. But Jesus going through all these things isn't just about fulfilling what he said. It's not just about him kind of revealing who he is so we might recognize it, but it's also a way of saying, hey, followers of me are going to be facing the heat. They're going to be having their own time of trial. Now, look, Mark's audience knows it in the form of a war that was happening in and around the time when Mark wrote his gospel. That's the Jewish war. We've talked about it. Jerusalem being besieged and destroyed. So they know these times of trial. But Jesus going through this is a way of being an example for them of how to do it well, of how to go through these things with your head held high, with kind of going through with faith and with courage. And that's really what that moment in Gethsemane represented, as we talked about last week. That was sort of his hero's journey moment. That was very much in alliance with classic Greek mythology of coming to this place of waver, but then almost instantaneously and somewhat formulaically saying, no, not what my will or my heart wants, but what your will wants. That sort of intention. And it's very powerful, but it's something that's also very instructive to us. And that's the hope. It's illustrating both who Jesus is and how we might go through these things well as we face them in whatever ways. Okay. Mark's audience was facing it in a very specific way, sort of a literal way. We may face it in different ways. Any questions or comments about that? Okay. So then Jesus, early on, what was it, verse 57 and 58 of chapter 14, it talks about some of the false statements that are being made. And this is more of Mark's just real, I think, capability as a writer here, but he says they make false statements, and then they say the stuff about the temple. And that's again 57 and 58. What about those statements is untrue? What makes them false? Horty?
Well, he did say the temple will not remain stone upon stone, but he never made any reference to it being reconstructed by hands not of the earth.
That's right. And did he say that he was going to destroy the temple? Right. He never said anything like that. He never said he was going to be the one to destroy it. He did say that no stone would be left standing. And he never said anything about rebuilding the temple in 3 days. So they've taken his words and taken them out of context. They've warped them. Okay? They've warped them. So then what is the effect? When you read this, and someone mentioned this, I forget who it was, like as a reader of this material, what's this creating in you when you see this? What's your response to seeing them do this to Jesus? Because he wants you to feel something. He's wanting you to respond, and he's intentionally creating this dynamic.
Frustration?
Yeah, clearly frustration. At whom? Or at what?
The lack of truth being presented.
The lack of truth being presented. Yes, that's part of it. Sure. Perry, I think I saw it. Yep, go for it.
In modern day terms, we call it fake news.
Yeah, well, they are completely missing it, which on one level we completely expect, because they've been missing it the whole time. So they're saying stuff that is a patent lie. And, I feel like as you were reading this, there's probably something going on. We should be getting upset about it. We should be saying this is absolute BS. I can't believe they're saying this, even though we can completely believe it. What Mark is doing here then is further creating an alliance between us as the audience and Jesus, the one who's right, the one who's going through it as just this with full integrity and full humanity. And then those ones that finally we can't relate to them anymore. It's harder and harder to relate to them outside of seeing them as just being like, you guys are just off the rocker, off the deep end. In that same way that using the modern term fake news is a way of dismissing the other. Mark has finally created such a rift between us and Jesus, and then all the other ones. So that would include the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin in general. And we'll pay attention to see how the disciples fit into this too. But that's what Mark's doing. In this chapter, he has widened the rift, okay? So that we as an audience are finally sort of just more and more done with those that are opposed to Jesus. So pay attention to your reaction, even if after this you go through and read it again, just pay attention to your reaction, because Mark's shaping that. Mark is shaping that within us. Now, it's not to say that they're completely dismissed, because at the end of the gospel, spoiler alert, the man in the tomb, the young man in the tomb, still tells them to go tell the disciples, right? So the disciples are not just ruled out, okay, all whole hog, but we are given this real rift here, this real distinction. Finally, they've just gone too far, with these lies, with these manipulations. That's what Mark's creating here. And it's really powerful as he does that. And then on top of that, in the face of their lies and their questions, this is the part where Jesus comes out and says, as clearly as in the entire gospel, who he really is. Okay. And so what's the effect of that? What are the effect of those words? But also, how does that statement that Jesus makes about I am, and then the Son of God, the Son of Man will come in the clouds, and that little section, how does that relate back to the parable of the tenants? can we deny after this statement who Jesus is anymore? This is as clear as you can possibly get. He uses the same words that God used to name God's self. I am. You can't get any more clear than that. So for him to say that is like, there's nothing more that needs to be said. And as Horty and maybe others have noticed, that is the last thing he says directly to people. He calls out on the cross, but that's we'll get to that. This is the last thing he really says. He's silent after that. In the parable of the tenants, if you go back and read it in chapter 13, chapter 12, I think, but it speaks of when they recognized the Son, they killed him. That's what the parable of the tenants tells us. When they recognized who he was, when they saw who he was, that's when they killed him. So Mark is playing off that, of the way that the parable of the tenants showed that as soon as they saw that it was the Son, they killed him. And this is a way of enacting that story. As soon as it was undeniable who Jesus was, as soon as he came out and acknowledged it, that's when all of the events of the crucifixion, I mean, after that, it just happens in a real tight form. It just goes boom, 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 and he's up on the cross. So that's how it connects back to the parable of the tenants. And again, this whole section is kind of relating back to the parable of the tenants and the apocalyptic discourse. So as you go back through, you can kind of make those connections. It's not necessary to do that, but it's all there. It's all sort of this way of affirming Jesus' credibility and authority as a prophet, and also the way that parable kind of plays out in Mark's telling of the story, how true it is. Okay. Questions or comments about any of that stuff? Jane?
Well, it seems like that because Jesus is just so concise with I am, and even though they haven't gotten it in the past, they get it now. Their soil is just not, they cannot receive it even then and go, oh my gosh, what should we be doing differently? They just follow their path, which is to do away with him, to crucify him. And,
Yes, because they receive what his words are as blasphemy, and that's all they can hear. Now, it is possible to hear it differently. There's no one forcing them to hear it that way, but that is their nature. That's how they hear it. That from chapter 3 to this point and beyond, that's what they've been all about, trying to figure out a way to take him out, because they thought he was a blasphemer from day one. And this is just one more illustration in their mind. But that's the tension that we get to see, because as an audience, we see that they're reacting that way, but we know that that is completely ridiculous. You know who else knows that it's completely ridiculous? Pilate. We'll get to him.
Pilate says that he knew they were envious.
Yes, he knew that the charges were trumped up. He knew that there was nothing in their complaint against him. Blasphemy is not a capital punishment offense in Rome, okay? That's just hearsay stuff as far as he's concerned. And he reacts to that, and in a sense, he's ready to let Jesus off. He tries multiple times. But we'll get to him, okay? Because first, we're at my favorite part of the entire gospel, okay? I just want to take a second here. Okay. So there's a scene here at the beginning of our reading, of the section of our reading. There's a marking of place in terms of Peter's specific location. And I'm looking at chapter 14, verse 54. Where it marks that Peter was following along. Jesus has been taken off to the council, right? And Peter's been following along and ends up in the courtyard of the same location where Jesus is. Okay, there's that time stamp, or that location stamp. Then after Jesus goes through his little interaction, his initial questioning period with the council, we come back to Peter. And it's another reference to that time stamp. That location stamp, that he's, and meanwhile in the courtyard, again, What is the effect? What is Mark trying to have us understand by giving us those two location identifiers for Peter that bookend Jesus' encounter, questioning with the council? What is that supposed to make us appreciate or see? Boys?
Seems like he's definitely removed physically from Jesus. He's not near him.
Yes. Yes, we know that. We know that he is removed.
So it also says he's spiritually removed because he denies him.
And we will see that exemplified absolutely. In terms of the event, the encounter that Jesus has, and then what's happening with Peter, there's a when here. When is all this happening? Bonnie, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
Well,
Oh.
this is all going on with Peter in the courtyard while this is all happening.
Yes.
with Christ. I kind of picture a stage, and Christ is up here on the, and then down here on the regular stage part is the courtyard, and that's what's going on with Peter.
This is so brilliant, and it's good noticing. That's exactly what it's conveying, that these two events are happening simultaneously. It's powerful stuff, because here's what's going on. Jesus is going through, they're questioning him. He's answering in truth. He's speaking with integrity. He's putting himself out there. And at the same time, what's Peter doing?
Just
Being silent.
Not being silent.
Yeah.
Denying him.
Well,
Yeah. Running away from it. Basically the opposite of Jesus. It's this incredibly dramatic, this contrast that's being shown to the audience that we appreciate. Oh my gosh, all this is happening at the same time. And so at the end, when they're mocking Jesus and they say, prophesy, we know that immediately when they go to Peter, that's exactly what Jesus has already done. He's prophesied exactly what Peter is doing. They don't see that as a council.
Okay.
They miss it. They're just mocking him. But as the audience, we go right to Peter and we see this is the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy about Peter. Boom. It's an incredibly powerful and succinct means of once again demonstrating Jesus' reliability and authority as a prophet, but creating this wonderfully rich narrative scene that conveys all of this in just a few verses, to me is just, once again, sheer genius. And as we see Peter go through what he's doing, it's just so powerfully contrasted to what Jesus is doing and being. And here's Peter. And here's the other thing. How is Peter's triple denial ironic? How is it ironic? He denies Jesus 3 times. How are his 3 denials incredibly ironic? Boys?
Well, he is so vehement that he would never do that. And I'm wondering if he did that 3 times.
I mean, the story says,
Jesus said, you're going to deny me. And he denied that. He said, no, I'd never deny you. And
gotcha. Well, he certainly was vehement and in his denial that he would deny him, which is ironic itself. We talked about that last week when he goes through that. But in these actual denials, what is so ironic about this? Ironic about what he says? Especially when he says, I don't know the man.
Yeah.
I don't know him. I don't understand.
Never met
He's
him.
exactly right. He's telling the truth. This dude doesn't know Jesus at all. He doesn't understand him. He's missed it. It's just, again, so much there in those statements. And that's just another illustration. And that sort of way that Peter just keeps going, digging his own hole deeper, it again, as I was saying before, it creates this more of a rift between us as the audience and Jesus, and our alliance with Jesus, and the way he's behaving and holding himself, as opposed to Peter. And I'm not trying to say we hate Peter. We don't hate the disciples, but we increasingly see the rift between us and them. And our reaction, and maybe you paid attention to this, maybe not, but go back, and I think our reaction is, I wouldn't have done that. Damn straight I would have been, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. Now look, that could be bluster, but he's shaping us as an audience to react, to finally say no to that way of being, that rocky soil way of being. And yes, that this is the soil I cultivate. It's a start. To say that is not to enact it. That's different. But Mark is shaping us as an audience to really create this more intense reaction to the scenes here. Okay. Questions or comments? Yes, Kathleen.
You know, I've never thought about it the way you just said that Peter it was ironic because Peter really didn't know him. I've just never thought that. Yeah.
And that's so poignant, because what it's saying is, and really throughout, go back and just think about the whole gospel and the way that it's been communicated. Those who would be close to him or who are close to him, the ones we would expect to know him the best, clearly misunderstand and know him very poorly. They just don't see who he really is. Peter's almost gotten it, but then shown that he doesn't get it. You're the Messiah, but no, you're not going to die. That's not going to happen to you. See, he's illustrated throughout. And again, he's emblematic of all the disciples, truly, but he's illustrated throughout the gospel that he really doesn't know Jesus. He doesn't understand him. Okay. Again, this highlights all those distances there. So it's aligning us further with Jesus as he walks this walk. It's aligning us, in our hearts and in our desires. It's stirring us as an audience. As we hear this, as we see this, we're like, man, all right, it's time. I want to walk with Jesus. That's part of this. It's leading us down that path. Well, the next part we get to kind of continues that trajectory. And that's this, finally, the portion with Pilate. And that interaction is one that is so rich. And, I just want to say or ask initially, because I think we've talked about this, but just now that you've read it and can see it, what kind of soil is Pilate in Mark's typology?
He's with the weeds.
Yeah, he's the thorny soil. He's the one that sees it. He sees clearly enough to know that these charges are made up, that it's out of jealousy, it's out of envy that they're doing this to him. He sees no reason. There's no reason to kill this man. Okay? Oh, another thing, there's no custom within Rome during the Passover, no known custom of releasing a prisoner. That's a made up thing. But it serves Mark's story well. Why? What does the name Barabbas mean? Peter.
Son of God.
Son of the Father. Yeah. Son of the Father. But yes, it's meant as a it's supposed to be like, okay, here's one son of the Father, a murderer, a common criminal, and then this son of the Father who embodies a healer, a servant, one who loves humanity. Okay. And it presents them to the people for them to make a choice. Which son of the Father will they choose? And I shouldn't say the people. It presents them to the Jewish authorities, who are the ones that are really calling out for this crucifixion thing. The irony is, of course, they choose the wrong son of the Father. But that's what Mark's playing on. So it really doesn't matter that this wasn't really a tradition within Rome. It really once again sort of drives that nail into the heart of this story and into us as an audience. We've said enough with the hardened soil of the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, enough with the rocky soil of the disciples, and now enough with the thorny soil of those like Pilate, who have the power and the possibility and the potential right in their hands, and they give it up because they don't have the spine to do what's right, even though he knows it, just like Herod. Okay, it's so poignant. And Mark is just setting all of this up to lead us to, this place where we have nowhere left to go except, so then what are we going to do? He's led us to say enough with this. And then it's up to us, what we do from there. But at this stage, Mark is so adeptly moving us into this deep identification with Jesus and sort of a release, finally, a release of all those other types of soil. Okay? Questions or comments about that? Okay. Well, we can come back to it if there is anything. After that whole Pilate thing, and they say crucify him, they famously dress him in the purple robes, and they wrap around the thorny, the thorny crown on his head. And what is this supposed to be? Why do they do this? Bonnie?
Mockery.
Yeah. Okay. It's a mockery. They're setting him up as a, you think you're like Caesar. Okay, we're going to dress you up like Caesar. There's something interesting, though, that Mark does throughout the gospel with Jesus' garments. Okay, think back. How is it that Jesus' garments function throughout the gospel? What are some of the ways that you can remember his garments functioning in this gospel? They literally have a way of, they convey a power. So what is it that you remember? What are some of the ways his garments themselves throughout the gospel communicated power or just performed symbolically? Bob?
One passage was the lady touched the garment, a woman touched the garment, was healed.
Yes. So his garments have the power to heal. We've seen that. What's another symbolic rendering of his garments? Boyce?
I think there was a time that he asked who touched him, so it got his attention, I guess.
That's the same story, in fact. The same story when the woman in the crowd touches his garments and is healed, the woman with the bleeding. And he's like, who touched me? And his disciples are like, what are you talking about? We're in a huge crowd. Why are you asking such a question? But he felt the power go through him. So the power to heal happens through his garments. Is there another story you can think of that really pertains to his garments and their symbolic, meaning in that story? Bonnie?
This is a guess, so I may be way off. When Moses and Elisha came on the mountaintop, was there something about his garment that was radiating, that was bright?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, what Mark says is they became whiter than any bleach could possibly make them.
Yeah.
So his garments become white. There's this radiant power. Okay, that when he is in that moment of transfiguration. And now, so those are two prominent ones. And just like you recalled them, like, oh yeah, I remember that. The original audience would have had all that in mind too, and to recall them. Now, here's the question. We see them now compared with the mocking garb of an earthly king. Okay. What is the overall communication of how Jesus' garments tell us who he really is and who he is not? In a sense, to dress him up in these purple clothes and that thorny crown is not mocking him. Oh, they wanted to mock him, but in fact, it's telling us something very truthful about him. Okay. Again, more irony. Does anyone want to speak to that before I continue speaking to it? What is it about his clothes that that then communicate who Jesus really is and who he's really not? I'll go with Horty. I saw Horty's hand first.
I don't know that this is the answer to that, but I was struck by they put his own clothes back on him.
What do you mean after they did the
after they take off the purple robe and the crown of thorns?
Yeah,
they put his own clothes back on him.
Go ahead, Bonnie. Do you want to say something else?
Well, there was one point where it said that they cast lots for his clothes. And I thought that was interesting because if he was just any prisoner, you don't divide up his clothes and I want, a shirt and I want his pants or, whatever. You just don't pay any attention to him. So I thought it was interesting that they each wanted a little piece of his clothes.
We'll get to that too, because there's something very symbolically meaningful that why Mark uses that image there. Well, we'll get to that. Yes, Boyce?
It seems like he dressed more common and was not dressed as royalty, or he didn't look like a rabbi or a priest or anything like that. It was just one of us.
You're nudging towards it here. And here's the thing. They dress him up like an earthly king to mock him. Jesus would probably have said, you're exactly right. I'm not an earthly king. I have no interest in being a king like this. I never wanted to be. I never said I was. I never was about all that. What I'm about is healing. What I'm about is communion with the prophets and movement of the Spirit and the connection with the deeper purposes of God in our world. So his clothing kind of communicates to us very clearly who he really is, even when the characters in the story may miss it, but we see it. He's a healer. He's a teacher. He's a prophet. He's not a king. He's not an earthly king. He never pretended to be. He never wanted to be. But all along, they looked at him as if that's what he was trying to be. And again, once again, missing the point. And we see this now, and we're just like, enough of you. Get out of here. You guys, you've completely blown it, And so mocking him, they think they're mocking him. But again, ironically, it's speaking the truth. This dressing him up in this garb is very truthful. He's not that kind of king. Never wanted to be. Lots to chew on here. I know this is like one of those you're just like, huh. But it's this is just, it's sort of all coming together. This is the crucible chapter or section, for Mark. And it's really just sort of saying, all right, this is where the lines have been drawn. That so-called the die has been cast, at this stage. And that's why Jesus doesn't say anything else, because he said all that needs to be said. And those that are capable of listening will listen. Those who have ears to hear will hear. The characters in the story, all the different types of soil, we already know what they're going to do. But Mark's not concerned with that. Mark's concerned with you and me and anyone else who's taking this in. Okay. All right. Do you think it's a coincidence that the name of that passerby, the one that they say is forced to carry the cross, do you think it's a coincidence that his name is Simon? It is not. It is not a coincidence. Now, it's interesting, and there's some unanswerables here because I did as much research, and again, there's so many rabbit holes with this stuff, but calling him Simon of Cyrene, and then naming his sons Alexander and Rufus, that may have meant something to the original audience. They may have had an awareness of his sons, but it's not clear. And it's outside of our ability right now that I've seen. It's just, we don't know for sure what that refers to. But to call him Simon would hearken back to something. And we've already talked about this because I think it was just last week that Jesus, for the first time since calling Peter, whose original name is Simon. Last week, it was the first time then since that point that Jesus referred back to him as Simon. And do you remember what the name Simon recalls? It recalls that part, that time in Peter's life when he was the good soil, before he became a rockhead, before he became so hardened of heart and stubborn that he couldn't see or understand who Jesus was. That initial time when they met, and Simon was the one that said, yes, I will follow you. I will go where you lead me. So to recall that Simon and to name this Simon, once again, is one of those illustrations of this is what good soil looks like. All the Simons in the gospel show us what good soil looks like, or at least the potential for good soil. Jane?
Well, and as soon as you say that, it's like, and he carries the cross.
Yes.
He carries the cross, which is speaking of that moment, but also forward, future.
Yes.
He takes the whole mission of carrying the cross of Jesus to heart and becomes important to the church or to the, ongoing Christian.
Absolutely. He becomes part of the movement. And I don't know how much I have to say about the language they use when they say they compelled him, but it's just like there's this, whatever that is, as far as asking or getting him to do it, he just does it.
Yeah.
He gets in there and he does it. And remember back when Jesus is talking to the disciples, when he's telling them, you know what your job's going to be? To pick up your cross and follow me. And they all basically dismiss it. They may say, oh, well, at one point they may be like, oh yeah, we can do that. But we know that that's bluster. Sure, we can drink of that cup. Sure, we'll never deny you, blah, blah, blah. Who does it? Who actually does it? This Simon guy. But again, it reminds us of the Simon that's a part of who Peter is. Very, very powerful, a powerful reminder. And also like this little glimmer of hope for good old Peter. Because once again, even though we've created this huge rift, even though we finally as an audience said, enough of you disciples and your rocky soil ways, the gospel itself does not dismiss them whole hog. Now, they're not mentioned again. There's no appearances of disciples until chapter 16, verse 7. And they actually don't even appear then. They're just referred to. But there's there's a glimmer of hope in referring to them at the very end. Okay. But we'll get to that. That's for next week. We don't want to jump ahead, right? All right. Last thing I have to say, and then if there's any other comments or just like whatever it is that might be going through your head, that whole at the end thing where they cast lots for his clothes. And we're like, what the heck is that all about? Do they really just want a little piece of him? Maybe, but I don't think that's really what it is. Because when you go back to that parable that we've referred to, the parable of the tenants, it talks about how they kill the son and then they throw him out of the vineyard. Before they themselves are thrown out, they throw him out of the vineyard. The word for throw out, the Greek word, it's the same root as to throw dice. So Mark is playing on the themes of that parable and using this casting lots thing as a means of saying that this is their way, their final indignity, their way of being rid of Jesus once and for all, like finally, just taking his clothes and tearing them up and distributing this way. It's over. That's it. So casting lots is the same root as casting out from the parable of the tenants. So there's the setup. We're ending at maybe an odd place here with the fact that Jesus is on the cross now. He's been put up, crucified on the cross, and now they've just cast lots for his clothes. And we still have more of that drama to unfold. So he's going to have to stay there for this week until we get back to it. But I hope that what this has done is given you such an entry point into understanding where all these things come from. So looking back to see why Mark has chosen all these interactions and the way that we've been shaped. And again, if you're not relating to how I'm saying, that we react maybe as an audience when we read this, then just sort of like take the time and maybe go back and just sort of see, how are you reacting? What are you feeling? Pay attention to that as you go through it. But because Mark is trying to nudge us in that direction, to identify more completely with Jesus while we release those other types of soil. Okay. But also this dramatic, this dense material is pointing us towards the dramatic conclusion of the gospel, which will lead the characters to respond in one way when they see what they see and hear what they hear, and will ask of us, now, what say you? What will you do? Okay, so as you read this material again, perhaps, but as you prepare for next week, and that's basically the rest of 15 and all the way through 16, verse 8. And you know what? I just decided rather than doing an extra class on the end of the gospel, we'll include that too. So if you want to read the material that sort of finishes Mark, because some of your Bibles will have it. I don't know that all of them do. But the original ending of Mark is verse 8 in chapter 16. So that's really where we're going to be focused on. But we'll also talk about the rest. But pay attention to what Mark is what he's shaping you to do. What kind of soil are you? Where he's moved you in terms of your emotional investment, your emotional reaction to all of this. Because it's there. And as I've said before, if we're not finding ourselves really feeling that almost visceral reaction, then Mark's, he hasn't achieved what he's hoping to fully. Now, I get that. That's not necessarily about him. That might be the fact that we're reading it while we're watching TV or something. So give yourself the opportunity to really just do this and only this and see where it takes you. Questions, comments? Yes, Bertie, and then Ken.
Isn't the casting of lots an Old Testament prophecy?
Yes, I think it's from the Psalms, actually a Psalm. It might be Psalm 22, which would be interesting, but I have to look back. It is from one of the Psalms though. So that's that connection as well, that there's that reference to, and it might even come from Isaiah, where it may be a reference to the idea of the suffering servant, but it's playing on multiple themes there. You're absolutely right. But if it is Psalm 22, and I have to go back and look for that would be very interesting. But we'll get to that next week.
Okay.
It's Psalm 22:18.
Thank you. Well, that's very interesting because something else he says later is also from Psalm 22. But again, no, I've given away a lot of the spoilers, but we're going to hold that one.
Okay.
But did you have another follow-up, Bertie? Yeah.
Yeah, there was something else when you were talking about crucifixion being a Roman, and it made me realize that the chief priests really needed that kind of a death sentence, because I think the Jews used stoning, and they would have to dirty themselves by throwing stones if that was the way that he was killed. Well, so crucifixion removed themselves from.
In some ways, it was their effort to wash their hands of being culpable for the actual murder. But the irony is, as Pilate washes his hands, it really leaves him with dirty hands as much as it leaves the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees with dirty hands. And again, we have to be careful because historically that has been overstated to blame the crucifixion on the Jews. That's why I was so intentional about saying this is a Roman form of execution. But you're absolutely right. And the way that plays is that it leaves no one with clean hands. They're all sort of connected. They're all culpable because of the way that they responded to Jesus. Ken, did you have something else you wanted to add?
Well, I was thinking about Simon of Cyrene. You know, Cyrene is in Africa, and it seems like this is a foretelling of the spread of the gospel. And his sons' names are very much Gentile names.
Yes. Yeah, they're very much Gentile names. And that is part of the speculation as to what this connects to, is that it is another effort, just like saying when he comes back, where's he going to be? He's going to be in Galilee. That is a specifically Gentile location. And as we've said before, Galilee represents sort of the crossroads of all the trade routes in that whole area. So it was a very pivotal place, even though in and of itself, it was sort of just podunk town, but it was very pivotal in terms of the connection to various areas within the Gentile world. So yeah, certainly Simon of Cyrene functions not only as a reference to the good soil Simons, but also to the spread of the message. And that's what Mark does. He's employing these on a lot of different levels to communicate, where the gospel will go from here. But really his main concern is where it goes from here, and the story is one thing, but I care about where does it go in each one of you, in each one of us. That's Mark's primary concern. Boyce, and then Dan.
That thing of stripping off his clothes and casting dice and lots to divide them up reminds me of the guy that came with just a sheet on, and they took his clothes off and freed him. He ran away naked, but he was freed. And it reminds me of this. Jesus was freed, and the people that are crucifying him are left with his clothes.
Yeah.
Just reminded me of that.
Yeah, and there's a difference in the nakedness too. The nakedness of the young man is more the nakedness that reminds us of, say, the typical shame idea, that his nakedness was because he fled. He was another embodiment of the disciples in general, fleeing, and he lost his clothes, his linen clothing. Jesus had his clothing stripped from him, yet his story is not one that's characterized by shame. It's characterized by his integrity, by his truth, by his consistency, by his willingness to move forward in the way that he shows us. That is basically the opposite of all those other characters. So he's holding himself with this he's silent at this point. And again, it all happens so quick. There's not a lot of focus on the beating. There's not a lot of focus on, really anything. After the sentence is laid out, it all happens very quickly. Again, we'll come to that next week, though. Was there another hand? Dan, oh, that's right, Dan, and then Bob.
Well, I don't understand the thinking and decision-making of the Jewish hierarchy. They read the Bible. They understood the prophecies that were going to happen. Jesus lived those prophecies. Why didn't they believe it? Why did they call it blasphemy?
Well, that's the question of, that's why the gospel was written, to answer that question. They represent that more sort of traditional view, that expectation of who the Messiah was going to be. The expectation was that he would not only be in the line of David, but in the militaristic style of David, that he would be that sort of military champion king that would ride in on a steed and lead them to victory in the ways we think of victory, like a conquering king. That's not at all what he was. And they weren't ready to let go of that. We have a different perspective. We've seen these stories. We as people who follow Jesus, we are sort of approaching it from a place of being convinced of that, or at least moved by that. They were not moved by that. They did not buy that. They saw it as blasphemy because that was not what the expectation was. They thought it was going to be a literal coming on the clouds of heaven to rectify things. He came to say, that's not what I'm about, and that's not what the Son of Man is about. And the point is, it's still an open question, Dan. That's why Judaism, it's like, it doesn't convince everybody. And I don't know that it's trying to pit one against the other. It's not really a religious question. It's more about, where are you in this as an individual? But it's hard to remove ourselves from that, because we've all grown up with in a tradition that tells us that this is what it means. And so it's hard for us to really relate to, say, where the Pharisees might have been coming from, because we don't find that compelling. But that was their whole expectation, that it would be like this. And Jesus is not like that. So either we can just let go of all of our understanding of the scriptures and our tradition and our ancestors and all that, and just say, oh yeah, that's right, Jesus. Or we're going to dig our heels in. And we see what they did. We see what they did. But the gospel was written to address that question. All the gospels in their own way were written to address that question. Anyone else? Bob?
So when Christ was on the cross, the crowd taunted him and said, if you're the Son of God, come off the cross and show us that.
Yes. And again, we'll get to that next week, but there's a very specific reason why he has them say that. And then as what we know about how things work as an audience, we know already that to say that to Jesus is just an ineffectual comment. It's just not how it works. But again, I don't want to jump too far into that, because that's part of what we'll talk about next week. But yeah, the indignities continue. The ways that the crowds, and again, it's not just everyone, it's those that are shouting, the ones that are really aiming for him to be put to death. And that would be the religious authorities. They're the ones that continually just don't understand him or how it all works. So that indignity, that lack of understanding continues through the whole crucifixion. Boys?
I was wondering, when Pilate asked Jesus if he is the Messiah, Jesus kind of avoided that question and said, that's who you say I am, or something like that. And yet later on, Mark has him say, yeah, I am the Messiah, and I'm this and this and this, Son of God. And
earlier.
Pardon?
That was earlier that he said that.
Oh, okay. I thought it was after.
The council, he said that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why did he not? It just seems if he would have told Pilate, yeah, I am the Son of God, or I am the Messiah.
Yeah.
Maybe it would have turned out differently, but Mark had him not really answer the question.
Mark had him not really answer the question. And I wonder, I mean, does anyone have any ideas as to why he would have Jesus speak so kind of ambiguously there to Pilate? Yeah, he's just basically come out and said to the chief priests, to the Sanhedrin, to all the Jewish leaders who he is. And yet before Pilate, he says, well, that's what you say. Why would he be so ambiguous? What would be the point of that? Both for Jesus as a character, but more so, why would Mark have him do that?
Well, he did it someplace else also, where I don't know if it was Pilate, but somebody asked him, and he said, that's who you say I am.
That might have been, you might be thinking of the time where he's asking, the disciples, who are people saying that I am? And, he's responding that way. And in that instance, actually, they're responding in exactly the same way that Herod responded. So there's a connection there. So that's a way of connecting the rocky soil to the thorny soil. But why do you think that in this interaction with Pilate, that Mark's Jesus is so reticent to say, or just lets Pilate be the one to speak there? Horty?
Well, that's the point I was going to make. He needs Pilate to decide for himself.
Yeah, that'd be basically letting him off the hook. It would basically be letting Pilate off the hook. To say something like that, he could interpret as being like, oh, so you're saying you're the king? That's an affront to Caesar. Now I can kill you. No, he needed it to be about Pilate's, his own way of working through this decision. It wasn't, Jesus wasn't going to give him something on a platter to sort of then say, all right, off with your head. No. Pilate had to be the one, because what does he exhibit? He exhibits that thorny soil. Because what we see, what's true, is Pilate knows that they've trumped up this charge. Jesus knows that Pilate knows that. More than even Jesus, Mark knows that Pilate knows that. He's writing this. So Pilate exhibits that way of being. And again, the point of it is not just to show that Pilate's thorny, but it's to show us as the audience, as the readers, that that's not the way you do things. That is a possible way, and we all know that part of that type of soil within ourselves, but that's not it. And again, Mark, through this chapter, has really created the dividing lines here, and systematically has gone through and said, enough with you scribes and Pharisees, enough with your way of being disciples, and enough with your way of being Pilate. It's all unjust. It's all false. It's all manipulative. It's not good soil. I choose Jesus. That's really what this is shaping us. And I wonder, as you've read it, is that what you're feeling too? And we're being led down that path. But ultimately, the story leading us there is one thing. Us making choices with our lives and how we actually will live subsequent to this gospel is the real interest of Mark. Anyone else? Okay. Well, we've got one more session. So I look forward to that, even though I was saying to Barbara, I think Barbara Grandstaff, I was like, I just hate it when I come to the end of not hate it, but it's always a bit of a letdown coming to the end, because it's just so much of an energy thing. And I just love being in a particular story together, especially as we're just following all these undulations and it's like a cliffhanger every week. So it's kind of like, it's always a bit of a letdown, like when your favorite show has its, last episode. So anyway, I hope you're feeling that way in some ways, but it will continue. We're going to keep going with some of this stuff, just a different topic. So thank you all for being here. We'll see you at our closing, exciting conclusion to the story of the Gospel of Mark next week. All right. Till next week then.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. God bless you.
And
Thank you.